Welcome back to White Crow Quiz, my friends. Think you know your flags? In this challenge, you've got just 3 seconds to guess the name of all 195 countries by their flag. Let's see how many you can get right. Let's begin. Country number 1. You guessed it right, it's United States. Country number 2. You guessed it right, it's China. Country number 3. You guessed it right, it's India. Country number 4. You guessed it right, it's Russia. Can you identify the missing country amongst the top 7 nuclear powers? Let us know in the comment section. Country number 5. You guessed it right, it's United Kingdom. Country number 6. You guessed it right, it's France. Country number 7. You guessed it right, it's Germany. Country number 8. You guessed it right, it's Japan. Country number 9. You guessed it right, it's Italy. Country number 10. You guessed it right, it's Canada. Country number 11. You guessed it right, it's Brazil. Country number 12. You guessed it right, it's Australia. Country number 13. You guessed it right, it's South Korea. Country number 14. You guessed it right, it's Mexico. Country number 15. You guessed it right, it's Spain. Country number 16. You guessed it right, it's Pakistan. Country number 17. You guessed it right, it's Saudi Arabia. Country number 18. You guessed it right, it's Turkey. Country number 19. You guessed it right, it's United Arab Emirates. Country number 20. You guessed it right, it's Egypt. If you're here, it means you're enjoying the video. Please subscribe to the channel to watch more content like this and support us. Country number 21. You guessed it right, it's South Africa. Country number 22. You guessed it right, it's Argentina. Country number 23. You guessed it right, it's Indonesia. Country number 24. You guessed it right, it's Thailand. Country number 25. You guessed it right, it's Switzerland. Country number 26. You guessed it right, it's Netherlands. Country number 27. You guessed it right, it's Sweden. Country number 28. You guessed it right, it's Greece. Country number 29. You guessed it right, it's Vietnam. Country number 30. You guessed it right, it's Malaysia. Country number 31. You guessed it right, it's Portugal. Country number 32. You guessed it right, it's Belgium. Country number 33. You guessed it right, it's Poland. Country number 34. You guessed it right, it's Ukraine. Country number 35. You guessed it right, it's Iran. Country number 36. You guessed it right, it's Singapore. Country number 37. You guessed it right, it's Philippines. Country number 38. You guessed it right, it's Norway. Country number 39. You guessed it right, it's Denmark. Country number 40. You guessed it right, it's Iceland. Country number 41. You guessed it right, it's Colombia. Country number 42. You guessed it right, it's Chile. Country number 43. You guessed it right, it's Qatar. Country number 44. You guessed it right, it's New Zealand. Country number 45. You guessed it right, it's Morocco. Country number 46. You guessed it right, it's Iraq. Country number 47. You guessed it right, it's Palestine. Country number 48. You guessed it right, it's Cuba. Country number 49. You guessed it right, it's Bahamas. Country number 50. You guessed it right, it's Kazakhstan. Country number 51. You guessed it right, it's Austria. Country number 52. You guessed it right, it's Peru. Country number 53. You guessed it right, it's Finland. Country number 54. You guessed it right, it's Hungary. Country number 55. You guessed it right, it's Bulgaria. Country number 56. You guessed it right, it's Czechia. Country number 57. You guessed it right, it's Bangladesh. Country number 58. You guessed it right, it's South Sudan. Country number 59. You guessed it right, it's Romania. Country number 60. You guessed it right, it's Ireland. Country number 61. You guessed it right, it's Luxembourg. Country number 62. You guessed it right, it's Algeria. Country number 63. You guessed it right, it's Ecuador. Country number 64. You guessed it right, it's Venezuela. Country number 65. You guessed it right, it's Dominican Republic. Country number 66. You guessed it right, it's Jamaica. Country number 67. You guessed it right, it's Tunisia. Country number 68. You guessed it right, it's Sri Lanka. Country number 69. You guessed it right, it's Nigeria. Country number 70. You guessed it right, it's Kenya. Country number 71. You guessed it right, it's Myanmar. Country number 72. You guessed it right, it's Lebanon. Country number 73. You guessed it right, it's Jordan. Country number 74. You guessed it right, it's Panama. Country number 75. You guessed it right, it's Bahrain. Country number 76. You guessed it right, it's Bolivia. Country number 77. You guessed it right, it's Costa Rica. Country number 78. You guessed it right, it's Azerbaijan. Country number 79. You guessed it right, it's Serbia. Country number 80. You guessed it right, it's Guatemala. Country number 81. You guessed it right, it's Slovakia. Country number 82. You guessed it right, it's Slovenia. Country number 83. You guessed it right, it's Uzbekistan. Country number 84. You guessed it right, it's Kyrgyzstan. Country number 85. You guessed it right, it's Tajikistan. Country number 86. You guessed it right, it's Ethiopia. Country number 87. You guessed it right, it's Oman. Country number 88. You guessed it right, it's Uruguay. Country number 89. You guessed it right, it's Libya. Country number 90. You guessed it right, it's Armenia. Country number 91. You guessed it right, it's Nepal. Country number 92. You guessed it right, it's Bhutan. Country number 93. You guessed it right, it's Kuwait. Country number 94. You guessed it right, it's Belarus. Country number 95. You guessed it right, it's Latvia. Country number 96. You guessed it right, it's Israel. Country number 97. You guessed it right, it's Georgia. Country number 98. You guessed it right, it's Maldives. Country number 99. You guessed it right, it's Sudan. Country number 100. You guessed it right, it's Yemen. Country number 101. You guessed it right, it's Paraguay. Country number 102. You guessed it right, it's Cambodia. Country number 103. You guessed it right, it's Estonia. Country number 104. You guessed it right, it's Croatia. Country number 105. You guessed it right, it's Bosnia and Herzegovina. Country number 106. You guessed it right, it's Montenegro. Country number 107. You guessed it right, it's Syria. Country number 108. You guessed it right, it's Honduras. Country number 109. You guessed it right, it's Angola. Country number 110. You guessed it right, it's Turkmenistan. Country number 111. You guessed it right, it's Cyprus. Country number 112. You guessed it right, it's Albania. Country number 113. You guessed it right, it's Senegal. Country number 114. You guessed it right, it's Tanzania. Country number 115. You guessed it right, it's Uganda. Country number 116. You guessed it right, it's Moldova. Country number 117. You guessed it right, it's Namibia. Country number 118. You guessed it right, it's Mozambique. Country number 119. You guessed it right, it's North Macedonia. Country number 120. You guessed it right, it's El Salvador. Country number 121. You guessed it right, it's Papua New Guinea. Country number 122. You guessed it right, it's Mongolia. Country number 123. You guessed it right, it's Rwanda. Country number 124. You guessed it right, it's Zambia. Country number 125. You guessed it right, it's Botswana. Country number 126. You guessed it right, it's Ghana. Country number 127. You guessed it right, it's Ivory Coast. Country number 128. You guessed it right, it's Madagascar. Country number 129. You guessed it right, it's Fiji. Country number 130. You guessed it right, it's Nicaragua. Country number 131. You guessed it right, it's Haiti. Country number 132. You guessed it right, it's Barbados. Country number 133. You guessed it right, it's Trinidad and Tobago. Country number 134. You guessed it right, it's Brunei. Country number 135. You guessed it right, it's Burkina Faso. Country number 136. You guessed it right, it's Comoros. Country number 137. You guessed it right, it's Gabon. Country number 138. You guessed it right, it's Cameroon. Country number 139. You guessed it right, it's Zimbabwe. Country number 140. You guessed it right, it's Chad. Country number 141. You guessed it right, it's Sierra Leone. Country number 142. You guessed it right, it's Mauritius. Country number 143. You guessed it right, it's Eswatini. Country number 144. You guessed it right, it's Malta. Country number 145. You guessed it right, it's Guyana. Country number 146. You guessed it right, it's Laos. Country number 147. You guessed it right, it's Togo. Country number 148. You guessed it right, it's Suriname. Country number 149. You guessed it right, it's Gambia. Country number 150. You guessed it right, it's Benin. Country number 151. You guessed it right, it's Lesotho. Country number 152. You guessed it right, it's Solomon Islands. Country number 153. You guessed it right, it's Guinea. Country number 154. You guessed it right, it's Guinea-Bissau. Country number 155. You guessed it right, it's Djibouti. Country number 156. You guessed it right, it's Equatorial Guinea. Country number 157. You guessed it right, it's Vatican City. Country number 158. You guessed it right, it's São Tomé and Príncipe. Country number 159. You guessed it right, it's Kiribati. Country number 160. You guessed it right, it's Samoa. Country number 161. You guessed it right, it's Tuvalu. Country number 162. You guessed it right, it's St. Lucia. Country number 163. You guessed it right, it's St. Kitts and Nevis. Country number 164. You guessed it right, it's St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Country number 165. You guessed it right, it's Seychelles. Country number 166. You guessed it right, it's Antigua and Barbuda. Country number 167. You guessed it right, it's Lithuania. Country number 168. You guessed it right, it's Dominica. Country number 169. You guessed it right, it's Palau. Country number 170. You guessed it right, it's Marshall Islands. Country number 171. You guessed it right, it's Micronesia. Country number 172. You guessed it right, it's Tonga. Country number 173. You guessed it right, it's Vanuatu. Country number 174. You guessed it right, it's Timor-Leste. Country number 175. You guessed it right, it's Nauru. Country number 176. You guessed it right, it's Belize. Country number 177. You guessed it right, it's Liechtenstein. Country number 178. You guessed it right, it's Andorra. Country number 179. You guessed it right, it's Monaco. Country number 180. You guessed it right, it's San Marino. Country number 181. You guessed it right, it's Cabo Verde. Country number 182. You guessed it right, it's Mauritania. Country number 183. You guessed it right, it's Liberia. Country number 184. You guessed it right, it's Mali. Country number 185. You guessed it right, it's Malawi. Country number 186. You guessed it right, it's Central African Republic. Country number 187. You guessed it right, it's Niger. Country number 188. You guessed it right, it's Democratic Republic of the Congo. Country number 189. You guessed it right, it's Republic of the Congo. Country number 190. You guessed it right, it's Somalia. Country number 191. You guessed it right, it's Grenada. Country number 192. You guessed it right, it's Burundi. Country number 193. You guessed it right, it's Eritrea. Country number 194. You guessed it right, it's Afghanistan. Country number 195. You guessed it right, it's North Korea. Thank you for watching our Guess the Name of 195 Countries by Their Flag video. We hope you enjoyed the challenge. Your support means a lot to us. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more fun quizzes. Select your next challenge from below. Thanks for being part of our community.